Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to this panel discussion on the year ahead, what 2025 holds for Australia in the world. I'm Jess Collins, Research Fellow and Project Director of the Australia Papua New Guinea Network here at the Institute. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, whose kinship ties and ongoing connections are to the land on which we meet here today. I pay respects to their elders, past and present. Ladies and gentlemen, on the 10th of February, the Lowy Institute held its first event for 2025, titled The Year Ahead. It was held in Melbourne. We are now just 17 days after that event, and yet the world already appears much different. Because during those 17 days, President Trump has blamed Russia's invasion of Ukraine on Ukraine itself. And America is now voting alongside Russia and North Korea in the UN General Assembly. Australia and Papua New Guinea entered negotiations for a defence treaty, and just days later, the People's Liberation Army Navy fired ammunition off the coast of New South Wales. Given how much has changed in just a few weeks, we thought it was appropriate to hold a sequel to our first event in Melbourne, The Year Ahead Mark II. And today we have convened an excellent panel of Lowy Institute experts. Hervé Lemahieu leads the Institute as Director of Research. He's an expert on strategy and geopolitics, global governance, Australian foreign policy, Southeast Asia, and for the purposes of this panel is our resident European. Richard McGregor is Senior Fellow for East Asia. He's a former Beijing and Washington Bureau Chief for the Financial Times and the author of numerous books on East Asia and the Chinese Communist Party. Susannah Patton is Director of the Southeast Asia Program and Project Lead of the Asia Power Index. Before joining the Lowy Institute, she worked at the United States Study Centre and in various Southeast Asia-focused positions in the Australian government. Robert Walker is Research Associate and Economist in the Institute's Indo-Pacific Development Centre. His work focuses on emerging Asian economies and growth and development in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will have time for questions at the end of this panel, so please get thinking on the questions you'd like to ask our excellent panel. Now, you might have seen today in the news that Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong released a snapshot of Australia in the world, explaining how Australia's foreign policy can protect and prosecute Australia's national interests. The snapshot says, President Trump's America First agenda envisages a different role for the United States in the world. So let me start by asking a question to the whole panel. With just 1 month down now on the new US administration, and boy, what a big month it's been, what does this statement mean to you? Hervé, I'll start with you first. How is the American First agenda reshaping America's role in Europe?
Thanks, Jess, and thank you also for agreeing to chair today's event. And I should also note for the record that this is sadly the last event at which Jess does at the Lowy Institute under her guise as a research fellow. You're about to leave the Institute and move into a career into federal politics. So we want to congratulate you for that. We're excited for you. We will, of course, miss you a lot. And we love the fact that we can do this one last event together as colleagues. So let me get started with Trump 2.0. Obviously, yeah, as you say, it's been a huge month. A lot of bluster, an opening act which has jarred many, even if anticipated. So I think that is probably the way to characterize it. And it's worth potentially just looking at how Trump 2.0 is shaping out to be a very different kind of beast than Trump 1.0. And at the outset, and just in the sort of broadest possible terms, I think an abnormal world has licensed Trump to be a more abnormal president. So it's not just who he is and the fact that he's less constrained domestically, but it's the fact that the world that he was last in power in January 2021 looks very different to the world today. We now have active conflicts in the Middle East and in Europe. China is inching closer to consolidating a sort of Sino-centric order in Asia. So the world looks very different, and the options are wide open. And I think part of the difference of Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 has to be the fact that the global context has changed so much. I think we've got to all own up to things we got wrong. Trump is not isolationist. He's expansionary. He's expansionary in a sort of Jacksonian sense, in the sense of President Andrew Jackson. He really wants to grow U.S. territory. And we've seen that in reference to Greenland, in reference to the Panama Canal, even Canada, and potentially Gaza. So the aspiration for territorial expansion is there. But he's also ideologically expansionary, right? This is a project. The MAGA project doesn't stop at the US border. And if you listen to J.D. Vance's speech in Munich, this was really a statement of intent. We want to rewire, remold the way that Western democracy functions in our image. And that's a real threat for liberal democracies, particularly in Europe, but potentially also for Australia. Secondly, I'd say he's not even transactional. I mean, he's outright predatory and exploitative in many ways. Certainly when it comes to smaller countries, to allies and friends. He's made enemies of friends and friends of enemies, I've heard said as well. And so that is something else that we need to contend with. Thirdly, I would say he's not strong. I mean, keep in mind that his critique of the Biden administration was that it was weak. But I would say that if you're sitting in Beijing or Moscow right now, you're drawing a straight line, a straight parallel between Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan and a potential peace deal that favors Russia and Ukraine. It doesn't matter who the US president is, they smell weakness, not strength. And so he stands tall with smaller players, he punches down, but actually with adversaries and great powers, he's demonstrated weakness. All of that is not a very good sign for anyone that is an ally of the United States. We can go into more detail, but it's worth at the outset just explaining, I think, what we got wrong about Trump 2.0.
Hervé, you mentioned that you were at the Munich Security Conference where J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, made that very big speech. What was the feeling on the ground with the people that heard that speech? For the Europeans, it was a sort of, they were expecting a speech in which J.D. Vance would outline America's strategic posture relative to Russia and a peace deal, the sort of outline of a peace deal over Ukraine. And instead, they got an outright assault on European liberal democracy. So it sort of just opened one other front in what is turning out to be quite a sort of adversarial relationship with the United States. So the US is not only now a threat in terms of the trade relationship, the transatlantic trade relationship, it's not only putting a big question mark in terms of the future of the war in Ukraine and US support for Ukraine, but it's also going after basically centrist parties and decades of post-war tradition in Germany built on the lessons of history, not to do business with the far right because of the consequences, obviously, that the Germans and everyone else in Europe had to deal with the rise of Hitler. So it felt quite existential, actually. And it's easy to make fun of the Europeans. They make it easy for themselves. I think there are different camps, different schools of thought in Europe. You have the sort of moralizers in Germany, the tut-tutters, the finger-waggers, who don't really get on to anything. They tend to sort of admire a problem but don't really sort of get on with answering it. Then in the Nordic states, the Baltics, you have the sort of the pragmatists, those who are really beefing up defense spending in reaction to Russia. But also more willing to engage the Trump administration or whichever US administration because they're such an important partner. You've got the sympathizers, Viktor Orban, and the endorsers of Trump who visit Mar-a-Lago.
And then you've got the French. I think they're sort of a pole unto their own in terms of always being opportunistic and wanting to consolidate a sort of French-led European strategic autonomy. But the amazing thing about Munich was that all those camps really came together. I think this sort of moment of strategic disorientation in Europe actually turned into a moment of strategic clarity. And we saw that with Zelensky's speech, multiple standing ovations. He was calling for a European army. Now, I don't think that's going to happen immediately, but it certainly captured the zeitgeist. And whether you're in Berlin, whether you're in Finland, or whether you're in the UK or in Paris, I think there's a recognition that, yes, of course, you have to continue to engage the Americans and influence them to the extent possible, but that Europe is going to have to do more for itself in terms of defense spending, that we have to start considering Plan B options, so maybe a European NATO or a defense pact that holds not only the EU member states, but also Britain, Norway, and others together with or without the Americans. So in some sense, I left feeling kind of optimistic. I derive optimism from Europe's pessimism, because it's exactly the process they need to go through to really turn the page decisively. And it reminded me a bit as well of Europe's reaction to COVID. It often takes a crisis for Europe to kick into gear, and when presented with an existential crisis, that's when you see institutional reform take place. So in the long run, and leaving the Ukraine question aside, I'm optimistic that Europe will be able to do more in the sort of 5 to 10 years to come.
Thanks, Hervé. Now, Richard, we've just heard about all the different players in Europe. In Asia, there is clearly a dominant player in China and President Xi. How do you think the American First agenda is going to affect the US's role in Asia, and particularly with relations with China?
Thanks, Jess. Well, in terms of owning up to mistakes, I should recall that the last time I was on this stage before the American election, I predicted a Harris win. I don't know if it was a stupid thing to say, but owning up to it there. But as for what we say today, as you say, you talked about things are different than 17 days ago. Maybe we need a year ahead for 2025 every month, and then we can get it right. But look, on China, in America First, particularly the Trump administration, there's no coherent China policy in the Trump administration. Maybe that's by design. I resist the idea that Trump is sort of playing four-dimensional chess and going in all ways and outsmarting us all. I think it's more chaos is the sort of medium as much as anything else. But you look at the China-related appointments. Marco Rubio and all the team in the National Security Council, traditional China, Republican China hawks. If you look at trade appointments, Peter Navarro, USTR, which was announced, cleared through the Senate today, China trade hawks, don't really care much about national security. You look in the Treasury, Mr. Besant, he's a deal maker, a Wall Street deal maker. Trump himself, he cares about trade imbalances and he cares about fentanyl. He's not a traditional hawk, national security hawk at all. And you see the way he talks about Taiwan, utterly transactional. He thinks Taiwan's ripped America off, and he thinks that they should be paying insurance on top of tariffs if they want US protection, which he's not minded to give. So that's the first thing. There's nothing coherent so far. Secondly, Beijing is much better prepared for Trump 2.0 than they were previously. Trump did quite well in the first term in getting leverage with China, kept them off balance. They couldn't handle him. They didn't know how to handle him. But this time I think they're much better prepared to retaliate in a much more targeted way. They've passed various laws in China allowing them to target US companies and entities and the like. The US will be doing a tariff war. China will be doing a supply chain war, taking little bits out of the supply chain where they can put pressure on the United States, and I think they're very good at that. Yes, if Trump put a 65% tariff on Chinese goods, that would hurt a lot of Chinese businesses operating on thin margins, but then I think tariffs would probably bounce back on everybody. Briefly on Southeast Asia, and I know Susannah's going to talk about this, but I've been travelling there a lot lately. You know, a disruptive US is music to China's ears in Southeast Asia, obviously up to a point. But, you know, the East is rising, the West is declining. That's the Chinese mantra. That plays very well in Southeast Asia. You know, China's message in Southeast Asia and to the global South generally is, you know, we, China, will put you, developing country, at the centre of our new world order. The Americans will ignore you. And of course, Trump plays into that. The Chinese narrative, you know, anti-colonial, anti-American, anti-Western, anti-imperialist, works really well in Southeast Asia. And of course, if the tariffs all go ahead, then, you know, Vietnam is going to be tariffed, Malaysia will be, Cambodia will be, amongst all the other countries. So that there's going to be a lot of pain for Southeast Asia, and that allows China, rightly or wrongly, to play itself as the good guy. Just finally, going back to the various strands of China policy, I should say that applies to Australia. You know, are we going to get an exemption? I have no idea. I think it's less likely this time. But the three camps you can see in there, there's the one camp, Australia is a friendly country, we should give them an exemption, a long-standing ally. There's a second camp, which is no exemptions for anybody. That's the Peter Navarro camp. And in between that, I think is the more, you know, the most fruitful area for Australia to focus on. That is the camp says, yes, Australia is friendly, but what are you going to give us in return for the exemption? So I think that sort of China sort of poles of ideology also plays out for Australia as well.
Thanks, Richard. Now, Susannah, we have heard a little bit about a little snapshot into Southeast Asia, but would love to hear from you too about, I guess, what perhaps might be the changing role of the US in balancing power in Southeast Asia.
Thanks. Let me just pick up on a couple of the threads of the discussion. I mean, I think one point to make really clear, and it's something that Hervé touched on, is just the difference between Europe and Asia. And Hervé said, you know, he's optimistic about the idea that the Europeans can do a lot more against Russia, even without the United States. In Asia, of course, it's a very different situation because, as Hervé and I wrote in an article last year, it's very much a situation where China can only be balanced by the United States. And so the critical question is the one which, as Richard said, we don't have a lot of clarity on, which is how the current administration is going to approach China. And from an Australian perspective, there's still very much an optimistic narrative which is possible on the basis of what we've heard so far from the Trump administration, that disentangling themselves from Europe will actually enable them to focus more on China. And there was, you know, people who are advocates of AUKUS, for example, will point to the fact that in the recent defence cuts that were proposed by the new US Defence Secretary, that Indo-Pacific was exempted from them, Virginia-class submarines were exempted from them, and so people are pointing to that and saying, you know, it could still be good news for us from this administration. But the key question is how the US approaches China. And for Southeast Asian countries, I mean, I think in many ways, compared with Europe or even compared with us as a US ally, most of them have a lot less to lose from a US which is more transactional. And in many ways, they already saw the US as more transactional, more self-interested, a more morally ambiguous actor, certainly, especially in the wake of US support for Israel following the war on Hamas. And so there really is, I think, perhaps less of a sea change for them and more of a gradual transformation. And a lot of people pointed to the fact that Singapore's defence minister recently said that the US had gone from being the upholder of the rules-based order to being a landlord seeking rent. And yeah, that's a fairly striking comment from a current official, not a former official. But actually, if you look back at what Singaporean officials said in the first Trump administration, they were already fairly explicit that they saw the US as a very self-interested actor. So I think that perhaps there's less of a sea change than there is in other parts of the world.
Thanks, Susannah. Now, Rob, we've heard a little bit about the transactional nature of the US administration at the moment, the potential for tariff wars. Do you want to talk a little bit about the America First agenda and its impact on the economies in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Jess, for the question. I guess with the America First agenda, we see, as you said, a very transactionalist approach. So Trump views, as Richard said, bilateral deficits with other countries as a huge negative. So he views international commerce and trade in a very zero-sum manner. You could even hark back to kind of mercantilist thinking around trade or protectionist thinking of the 1930s. So Trump's ideas of trade and international economy are kind of this weird mix of mercantilism and protectionism. What that means is that he has decided that tariffs are going to be how he addresses the kind of imbalances in the global economy and the bilateral imbalances he perceives as America losing out to other countries. So he's even said that tariffs are his favourite word, for instance. So he clearly sees this as a key policy tool to restructure the global economy and the US's trading relations with other countries. So he hasn't targeted Southeast Asia yet. These countries have kind of skated under the radar so far, but he has already imposed 10% tariffs against China. So under the first Trump administration, there was a trade war that Trump basically initiated against China. And the evidence is now pointing to the fact that that trade war basically incentivized a pretty significant relocation of supply chains out of China to other economies. One of the major beneficiaries has been Vietnam. Another is Mexico. Some of the other Southeast Asian countries did benefit from this, but not really to the same extent. It's kind of been a limited benefit. And then I think an extra 10% tariff on China's economy at this stage, that could accelerate that process. So it may be beneficial. But that's to say only if Trump doesn't go further. So I think if Trump really pushes his kind of tariff agenda even more, which it seems like he plans to do, he just announced overnight 25% more tariffs against the EU are basically a plan that he looks to enforce. I think if he goes ahead and implements the tariffs against Canada and Mexico as well, 25% again, that really will be much more destructive to global trade than just targeting China itself. I think that there'll probably be a bit of demand destruction there where you see global trade stagnating or even starting to decline at that point. That will really not be good for Southeast Asia. They're a trade-dependent region. They use trade to drive economic development and growth. So if global trade is starting to stagnate, these economies will see their kind of economic model really start to, I guess, creak at the seams. That they're not going to be able to lean on trade as much as they have been previously, and they'll have to rethink their economic development strategies, both in the short term and the long term.
Big impact there, big forecast. Thanks, Rob. Now, it is federal election season here in Australia, in case you hadn't noticed. So I wanted to ask about what this all means for the next government, because just a few weeks ago, it was predicted at the Year Ahead event in Melbourne that China hasn't fallen off the radar, but it won't be as much of an issue in this upcoming federal election here in Australia. At the time, this was a very reasonable remark. But just last week, a Virgin pilot saw the PLA Navy conducting live fire exercises off the coast of New South Wales. Situations can change and deteriorate very rapidly. So, Richard, I'd love to hear from you. Do you think this will be an election where foreign policy matters? Asking for a friend.
Well, I mean, it's one thing to say something is going to be an issue, and it's another thing to say it shifts the votes. Okay, so, if you look at all the surveys, the biggest issue for most people is cost of living. And so does China suddenly jump to the top of that? No. But let's look at the previous election. If you looked at the macro polling of how Scott Morrison's government handled China when we were in a full-on dust-up, I think most people supported the government taking a tough line for China, or if you like, standing up for Australian sovereignty. So it looked like, if anything, it would be a positive issue. But of course, all elections in Australia are close. There's about 6 seats, 4 in Sydney, 2 in Melbourne, Reid, Bennelong, Chisholm, Aston, with a majority of Chinese Australian voters. There's no such thing as a Chinese voting bloc. If there were, it would be easier to go one way or the other, but they have leaned conservative, socially conservative, business-minded. But in all of those seats, and this is not me saying this, both parties officially said this after the election, those seats swung at a much greater rate to the Labor Party than the coalition, and were important in securing a Labor win. Now, since that time, I think that has affected the way both parties and both leaders have talked about China much more carefully, and that includes Peter Dutton, who's very hawkish, but he's very careful how he talks about China. James Patterson has said the same thing. So then we get the flotilla, going through the Tasman Sea. Yeah, that's interesting. The opposition's quite right to hold the government's feet to the fire about how they handle that. That's a very legitimate source of debate. I guess there's 2 ways of thinking about it. On a meta level, I would say Australian voters expect the government to handle this in a steadfast, precise and clear fashion. Have they done that? Probably not. But does it then play in a micro issue away to the seats where Chinese Australians once again are worried about China being targeted and sort of shift back or stay with Labor? So it's unpredictable how it plays out and whether it's very decisive. The other point about foreign policy, of course, the biggest foreign policy issue in Australia is AUKUS. I think AUKUS has always struggled from its original sin. It was negotiated in secret. The Labor Party had to agree to it within 24 hours. Anthony Albanese probably didn't come into public life to build nuclear-powered submarines, but here we are. And I think the government has struggled to sell it. But I don't really think it's an issue which will change votes. People are going to vote for the Greens or maybe the Teals on that issue, and those votes will come back to the major parties via preferences. So I don't see that as decisive.
But I'll just follow up on that, because there is a possibility that we could have a hung parliament, and you brought in the Greens and the Teals there. What do you think will be on their foreign policy agenda if they have more of a say in the government?
Well, I don't think either the Coalition or the Labor Party will accept AUKUS being part of the negotiation. We do it or we don't. I would say, as far as I can see, and you never know what's going to happen, that on a micro level, I think if the Greens and or the Teals in the lower house have a balance, what would they be focused on with foreign policy, if anything? I would say the foreign aid budget, something like that. Maybe they would slightly favour Labor Party on foreign policy, but that's not very clear. The Greens, as they have to do, might make a big fuss about defence spending, etc., etc. But I think any issues in any sort of in a hung parliament would be very related to foreign policy, would be very micro.
Thanks, Richard. Susannah, what's your reading of the tea leaves? Do you think foreign policy will matter in this election?
Probably not, but I think it should. And I think, to me, it's concerning actually that given the situation that we're in globally, that there is a lack of foreign policy conversation. Just to say one line, this is from, you mentioned the snapshot that the government has just released, which is detailing foreign policy achievements over the last term in government. It says the foundations of the modern world that have been the basis for our stability and prosperity will continue to be tested. I mean, that's pretty concerning, right? And yet we seem to have both parties that are not really interested, for political reasons, I think, in having a forthright discussion about issues that will matter a great deal, whether it be AUKUS or our relationship with China or with the United States. And one thing that I think is particularly concerning in this context is the question of foreign aid, which Richard mentioned. Of course, our foreign aid budget in Australia is already incredibly small, so just 0.2% of GDP. Which is pretty pathetic. But at the moment, we've got a global situation where, of course, the US has put a freeze on USAID, and they're not the only ones. So the UK has just announced in the last couple of days they are going to cut aid spending by about 40% to pay for an increase in defence spending, which, you know, in that situation, maybe that's justifiable, but the Netherlands, Belgium, France, they're all cutting. And I think it would just be disastrous and incredibly concerning if Australia were to pursue that in any way. And in fact, we need to be spending more in our own region because others are going to be spending less. And it's very clear that, you know, that our relationships with our own region are where we can demonstrate self-reliance and actually reduce some of the geopolitical risks that we're facing from both the US and China.
Very quickly, I should have mentioned, is Israel-Gaza an issue in the election? It's an issue in the election, but once again, will it change votes? In some seats, people might vote on that issue as a sort of, you know, single-issue voter. In Western Sydney, does it threaten Labor Party seats where there are lots of Muslim Australians there as well? As far as I can see, that doesn't appear like it's going to happen. Now, famous last words, but I think if you were going to get that revolt in those Western Sydney seats on that issue, not cost of living, I think we'd have a better sense of it now.
Thanks, Richard. So we've heard just briefly about the potential challenges for Australia's foreign policy, and we've heard about how rapidly the strategic environment is changing. But despite of the uncertainty of it, I would love to hear from you about what you envisage will be the big issues coming up for Australian foreign policy over the next 3 years. What will be the big challenges? Are there any black swans, any surprises that we haven't discussed here that are unprecedented or unimagined? And Hervé, I know how you feel about black swans, so I'll just ask you for your forecast of Australia's big foreign policy challenges, particularly in Europe, over the coming years.
Yeah, well, look, I don't like black swans because by definition you can't predict them. But also I think we're in an era where anything is possible, and so expect the unexpected. You know, it sounds a bit trite, but it's kind of true. I would say that you know, coming back to Trump in the world, not simply to Europe, I worry more about his administration's incompetence than his administration's malice. Because if there is some continuity with Trump 1.0, I know I said it's obviously quite different, but there is some continuity. They've gone in hard and fast, of course, but it's not necessarily to say that they're more organized or more coherent than they were the first time around. I think what we're seeing is multiple power centers within the Trump administration. People are committing things and then walking them back. If you look at Hexeth and the speech he delivered to NATO allies about, you know, what they were going to propose to Russia, I mean, tactically and as a matter of principle, terrible, but then a few days later he says, well, actually everything's on the table, including potentially still offering Ukraine as some possibility of NATO accession or association. So, you know, the glass half full argument here is that, you know, Trump can mistake trinkets for trophies. That is a problem when you put him in front of Russia and you go over the heads of European allies and Zelensky in Ukraine, but it can also be used to great effect, right? And so what we saw the Ukrainians do just over the last 72 hours was to propose this critical minerals deal, which was a trinket that you know, attracted him faster than whatever the Russians could propose. So it does go to show that I think the Trump administration is still malleable, and can be influenced, but is chaotic and unpredictable. And so I'm not sure if that qualifies as a black swan, but it's just something that we are going to have to deal with. In terms of what Australia does, I mean, are you asking for how the government should tackle foreign policy in the next, or is that coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. Forecast whatever you like.
Yeah, okay. Look, I think there's a couple of couple of things that matter regardless of who wins the election now. One is on defence, and I take Susannah's point about the UK's difficult decision of having to cut aid and favour defence. I don't think the same applies to Australia, simply because in absolute terms, but also in relative terms, we are far less generous than the UK, but also because we've already remolded our aid budget to suit our strategic purposes, and is targeted much more specifically and narrowly on the Pacific and then a bit on Southeast Asia. It's already not altruistic to begin with. It's much more strategic. But nevertheless, we are going to have to spend more on defense. And in this sense, I sort of agree with some commentators like Greg Sheridan, but I also disagree at the same time. We need to spend more on defense, not just to please the Americans. More importantly, we need to do it despite the Americans. I mean, we have to do it because we are so uncertain now about the US's long-term role in this part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific, and the reliability of that US alliance. In Southeast Asia, let's not kid ourselves. The conversation is not, which great power they choose. For most, I think they are either aligning with China or drifting in that direction. It's not who they choose, it's how they choose. The terms of engagement now matter a lot. And this is a conversation we should be having with the region, and it applies equally to how we engage with our ally, the United States. In the Pacific, we've got to double down on combating China's willingness to constantly explore, constantly push the boundaries of a creeping sphere of influence, with not our own sphere of influence, but actually a sphere of integration. I've spoken at length about this before. We can go into details about what I mean, but I think we've got to be a lot more imaginative and daring about what we can do there. And there is a lot of asymmetric advantage that we have not yet tapped in the Pacific. And finally, I'd say on the United States in particular, and this might seem a bit counterintuitive given how dire I sound on Trump, but I think we've got to redouble our engagement with the United States. Why? Because we're probably one of the few countries in the world at this stage, I mean, this is certainly our comparative advantage over Europe, that has the ear of the Trump administration. We've flown under the radar. We're largely benign to them so far, and we can influence their calculus. And as I said before, I think the Trump administration is chaotic, it's incompetent, but it is malleable, and we need to work on that, not just for our own sake, not just for the bilateral stakes involved and for the exemptions possibly on tariffs that apply to steel, but more broadly in terms of looking or urging the Americans to consider that there is more than, don't mistake peace for appeasement in Europe. There is something in between there, and don't think for a minute that you've got to swing wildly from either preserving US primacy globally or carving the world up into spheres of influence with China and Russia. I mean, these are so extreme. We've done a lot of thinking within the Institute, but also I think within the broader strategic debate in Australia about how you can preserve a balance of power in Asia that is post-American primacy. But it involves the US continuing to be the offshore kind of balancer, to work with allies, to work with non-aligneds and similar-mindeds. And these are the conversations we need to be having with the Trump administration, and we need to be having them at multiple levels and with the different fiefdoms within the Trump administration, not simply the China hawks who we like to hear from, but acknowledge that basically there are competing ideological influences on Trump, and where he goes next is anyone's guess, but we should have a good try at influencing that.
Thanks, Hervé. And to your point about the Pacific and Australia's foreign policy challenges ahead, I think developing that long-term strategy for Australia and the Pacific and how integration is a key part of that is going to be one of the big challenges ahead for the coming government. Susannah, what do you think will be the main challenges for Australian diplomats in Southeast Asia over the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to step it back slightly, I mean, I think what's implicit in what Hervé has said is that our region, both Southeast Asia and the Pacific, is going to be ever more all-consuming for Australia. That's already a trend in our foreign policy, that we have less of a global focus, more of a regional focus. I think that's just going to increase. I mean, last year, under the Biden administration, we heard a lot about the so-called quartet of chaos, you know, the idea of coordination between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. I think we're hearing, for obvious reasons, less about that, and we will, and in a way, you know, the Trump administration, the fact they're so focused on the Western Hemisphere kind of is consistent with, I think, the trend that countries are going to be more focused on their own immediate geographic regions. And so the good news for Australia is that we already have been. And so in a sense, I don't want to call it a plan B because it's not a plan B. We still need the United States, absolutely. But it is very much an investment in our security that we have made in both the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The reason it can never be a plan B, though, is what goes to your question, Jess, about what are the challenges facing Australian diplomacy, is the region doesn't see the challenges and the threats the way we do. They're not strategically like-minded with us. That means, you know, we're not going to have the ability to really kind of form coalitions with countries in Southeast Asia that we see will advance our own security. Doesn't mean we can't have useful and practical cooperation on a whole range of issues, but it's never going to be that fully fledged plan B for a world without the United States. So I guess that's kind of like the good news and the bad news.
Rob?
Yeah, so going back to the black swan question and how Hervé was talking about this minerals deal that the US and Ukraine have just signed, I think it's very interesting to see that how that's played out. So initially you had Trump, as Hervé was describing, the US is now acting as an expansionist power. So they spoke about like basically annexing Greenland from Denmark. They were talking about Canada becoming the 51st state. I think I've seen on both of those scenarios, one of the reasons that Trump is considering those things as viable is because of the mineral resources that these territories and countries have. So he sees that as clearly a goal in mind in order to expand US resource wealth. And then again, you see this exact strategy playing out with the Ukraine minerals deal. Now, an expansionist and zero-sum Trump may look to Australian mineral resources. We have kind of tied our strategy with the Future Made in Australia Act to building Australia as a critical mineral superpower in the world. And we see ourselves as a key node in assisting the US build supply chains and critical minerals that are separate to China, where China has a lot of concentration in especially the refining but also mining investments across the globe. Now, you have to ask yourself, does Australia have a pretty weak point in negotiating with the US? I think on AUKUS they do. The US holds all the cards. Trump is a deal maker. He may want to make a more favourable deal on Australian critical minerals and use AUKUS to hang above us. I think we really should be considering that this is a downside risk to tying ourselves through AUKUS and US critical mineral supply chains. We need to think strategically about what that would mean, how Australia would respond. I don't think it's necessarily a given that Trump will do this, but it's certainly a risk, and I think that that conversation should be had.
Thanks, Rob. Richard?
So you know, there's black swans, and I think what they call in China, I don't know whether the Chinese invented it, grey rhinos, right? Which are kind of visible, but not. So on the point Hervé makes about getting closer to America, well, that's going to happen anyway. In a year or two, we're going to have US nuclear-powered submarines rotating permanently through bases in WA, near Perth, it's Stirling. That is going to make us a much more focused target, if you like, for the Chinese. The sorts of messaging that we've seen from the Chinese over the last week, in that flotilla was their most powerful, most lethal surface combatant boat. They don't send that just for the sake of it. That's a message there. We're going to see more of that. And of course, that is the Chinese flotilla is also tied into competition in the Pacific. As you mentioned, the Chinese did a deal with the Cook Islands under the nose of the Kiwis in particular and Australia in the past week and over the objections of the New Zealanders. And that's obviously a Chinese reply to all the manner of deals that Australia has done and done a very good job at, by the way, in PNG, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, a little bit in the Solomons, and the like. So I think there'll be much more sort of hard pressure from China on us in different forms.
Susannah, what's your response to that in terms of the potential for increasing activity in the South China Sea from Australia and its allies?
Well, I mean, I think we don't, again, this is one where it's very contingent on the US approach. Trump famously never said the word South China Sea in his whole first term in office, so it's unlikely that he cares a lot about the South China Sea.
Nor the West Philippine Sea.
Nor the West Philippine Sea.
Maybe second Thomas Shoal.
So, and I possibly should have mentioned this before when I was talking about Southeast Asia not being as, as affected as other parts of the world by the changing US administration. Of course, the big caveat and exemption there is the Philippines, which, of course, as a US ally, is extremely concerned about the risk that they could be left high and dry, and that the US wouldn't come in to support them. So I think, we've seen the Philippines try and get on the front foot and say they're going to buy US missiles and permanently base them there in an effort to get on the good side of the Trump administration. But it's anyone's guess. If we are facing a situation of a US that sees that it can make a kind of G2 bargain with China, then I'm afraid the Philippines and the South China Sea will just be a casualty of that.
Any comments to that, Hervé?
Yeah, I mean, yes, nothing further to add. It's looking pretty bleak, and the early signs of Trump being in deal-making mode as he looks at the world, and he's constantly on the lookout for a deal that will make him look good, that will settle in his terms a war, whatever it is, or a potential war, so he can win his Nobel Peace Prize. But there's a lot of hazard that could potentially come with that, and the temptation to look at Asia in the same way as he's looking at Russia and Europe is there, and something we really want to avoid at all costs if possible, because as Susannah's already mentioned, I think Europe could survive a post-American scenario. I'm not sure Australia could.
I think a lasting G2 is a fantasy.
That's good.
I mean, people talk about that. There's too many aspects of rivalry. It's over economics, technology, systemic governmental systems. I mean, Trump is extremely cynical. He hasn't really got the bandwidth, for his deals are about daily headlines. There was the Abraham Accords in the first term, but to really unpick the rivalry between US and China on so many levels and tie it all up in a nice bow, I really think that's far-fetched.
And the other thing that mitigates against it is that at some level, he doesn't want to be, he doesn't want his legacy to be abject humiliation, right? He cares for looking strong, and just because he's
got to be his third term coming up as well. Right?
That's right. And just because he speaks he's turning the US into a garden variety great power. So they're going to be less magnanimous. The sort of United States that we understood to be the US is no longer there. Certainly no longer there under Trump. Nevertheless, he speaks the language of Xi and Putin. Doesn't mean that he can reach agreements with Xi and Putin, because it's so zero-sum often, and he doesn't like being the loser at some kind of really primitive level. That is the card we have to play.
I think as well with China and the US, there used to be a perception that China was just going to inexorably grow and overtake the US by magnitudes, and that kind of narrative has certainly fallen away. And so I feel whilst the US policy space in Washington has really come around to the idea that they need to compete against China, they no longer see China's rise as inevitably displacing the US to the degree that was previously thought. And I think that probably also will hedge against Trump providing too many concessions that are unnecessary in that space as well.
Okay. We're going to turn to the audience now. I'd love for you to get ready for your questions, and if you can please state your name and your affiliation, that would help us too. Thank you, and we have a question up the back there. Microphone coming, just behind you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Richard Bronowski, former Australian diplomat. After 36 years serving Australia, mainly in Southeast Asia, I think we have to be careful not to reinvent the wheel. We had very good, constructive, careful relations with many countries in that region, particularly Vietnam and Korea. And I think we made mistakes during the Cold War about ASPAC and CETO, the unrealistic treaties. But right now we do have a much more realistic approach. In this morning's news, it was said that this flotilla, I don't know how many ships are in a flotilla. I thought there were just 2 surface ships coming to Australia and possibly accompanied by a submarine. If that's a flotilla, so be it. But the Vietnamese are having problems too. And one thing we can learn and have learnt from the Vietnamese is how to handle China. I think, therefore, that the diplomats we have in Southeast Asia are very much aware of this, and there's a lot of work going on under the scenes about what is happening. Just a comment, thank you.
Thank you very much. If we could have the questions for the panellists, that would absolutely help us.
We might say there are Chinese live fire exercises off the coast of Vietnam right now. So that's all happening. But anyway, well, I won't comment on it. Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Emily Forbes from Bird and Bird. We saw the appointment today of a new British High Commissioner to Australia, Dame Sarah McIntosh, with a distinctly defence, intelligence and security CV. What message do you think this sends to the region, and in particular under the context of AUKUS?
Yeah, I haven't followed the news that closely, but I just, in some ways, it makes a lot of sense. We've just sent a former chief of the Defence Force to Brussels as our ambassador there, and you know, it's obvious that the NATO component of the Europe-Australia relationship is growing in importance, and similarly, if you're looking at the UK-Australia bilateral relationship, the AUKUS component is starting to grow more, and so we need to basically deepen those working level ties. There is a question mark more broadly, I think, particularly in the wake of the Munich Security Conference, where it's become clear that Europe's existential crisis now is not simply dealing with Russia, but the potential absence or withdrawal of the United States, about the bandwidth that any European player, including the Brits, have to dedicate to the Indo-Pacific. It's clearly not going to be their number one priority. Now, there are ways we can continue to engage them. They are as cognizant as we are that these two theaters are distinct but interconnected. We've got North Koreans fighting in Ukraine. So the need for conversation and cooperation, and for liberal democracies to do more in the absence of the United States potentially, will continue to grow. So I think it seems to me a wise choice of a diplomat.
Anybody else? No?
Good afternoon, Michael Collins from Strategic Development Group. Thank you very much. Susannah, Rob, I was grateful for your comments about the implications for Southeast Asia of a trade war, both opportunities, you mentioned Vietnam under Trump 1.0, and the threats as well. If those threats play out and those tariffs play out negatively for the Southeast Asian economies, I'm wondering, is there an opportunity for Australia to lean into those trade relationships? Rob, perhaps, how much complementarity is there between the Australian economy and those economies to make that work? And what might the implications be, both kind of economic and strategic, of us really leaning into those trade relationships? Thanks.
Great, thank you for the question. Yeah, really pertinent question, as this is a great focus of Australian diplomacy at the moment, is how much we engage with Southeast Asia, both in terms of economics and strategy. I might leave the strategy side to you, Susannah, but yeah, I think certainly Southeast Asia will be seeking other partners in the region, especially if the US does kind of withdraw or target them with tariffs specifically. So Australia can certainly play a role there, and maybe even a mediating role between Southeast Asia and America if relations really deteriorate. I think, though, that in terms of stepping up economically with, say, a US withdrawal, it's probably not that realistic to imagine Australia stepping up to a significant extent. We're just too small an economy compared to the US. And so I think there is a limited bandwidth to how much could really be substituted towards Australia away from the US in terms of demand, trading relations, that kind of thing. That's not to say, though, that I think that there aren't real and pretty significant opportunities available, but those need to be teased out at a government-to-government level and also a private sector-to-private sector level. So I think it's pretty difficult to emulate what the trading relationship with the US would be with Australia for these Southeast Asian countries, and they would need to find the complementarities as things progress. One thing I would say, though, is that Southeast Asia is emerging as like a pretty significant supplier of renewable energy technologies. With the kind of climate skepticism now overtaking the US, maybe there'll be a lot more cheap renewable technologies and manufacturing available for Australia. So that'll be definitely a boon to our energy transition.
Anything to add?
Nothing to add, no. Great.
We have a question down the front here and one up the back too.
Yeah, Paul Myers, I just thought I'd ask a question. With the new US that's now presenting itself, is it too soon for us to be rethinking how close we are to the US, given that the relationship now looks like becoming more a zero-sum game where we support the US but are unlikely to get any favours in return?
Well, I mean, I guess we think about this all the time at different times. We probably might have, yeah, I mean, I understand the question, but if we start to unravel that thread, it's a pretty big deal. What do we get instead? From whom? I mean, the relationship is not just about so-called shared values, looking a bit, leathery at the moment, but, the intelligence relationship, the military relationship. If you think China can coerce Australia, do you think the US can coerce Australia in various areas as well? And I think we get a lot out of the relationship. So, I understand the need to distance from Trump, hedge in various ways. Southeast Asia is a bit of a hedge. But I think if you start unraveling that, and we get another administration, Trump goes, right? Trump could be defenestrated in the midterm elections in 2 years. He could lose both houses. The Democrats could get their act together. And then what do? We sort of get back with the US at that stage. We don't have a viable alternative in many areas. And so I think we should think about what we get out of it and what we can preserve out of it rather than unwinding it.
I think as well, the economic relationship is quite important. So just on export terms, the US might not be that important for Australia. I think the US is under 5% of Australia's exports. But they're the largest two-way investment partner for Australia. So you have to ask what a decision like that at a political level what impacts that will have on our economy if they're the largest two-way investment partner.
Yeah, there's a lot less sentimentality. I think that's something that needs to go. No rose-tinted glasses in engaging the United States, but the alliance is a critical vehicle, not just of concrete benefits in terms of intelligence sharing and the like, but also a critical vehicle by which we influence DC. It's not just them influencing us. It's a two-way relationship. Sometimes the tail can wag the dog. We've often seen that in the Pacific with smaller Pacific countries dictating the terms of engagement with Australia, the much larger partner. I think we need to start thinking in those terms. And also, I mean, to borrow somewhat maliciously, the dictum that this government has applied to China, which is, engage where you can, disagree where you must, and always pursue the national interests. I think if that's the sort of logic, then the US alliance still makes imminent sense.
We have just a couple of minutes left. We might just get in one last question.
Thank you. Dimitri Keisha from Sydney Festival. Noting the events of the last week in the flotilla, etc., but also the events of the last 12 to 18 months, and also the election the next 2.5 months or so, foreign policy and diplomacy in the region, development in the region is never necessarily an election topic, but do you think all of these events will act as a wake-up call for Australia and the South Pacific and our relationships to massively up the ante, or will it just be forgotten?
Yeah, I don't know whether the election's a galvanising event for that. I think in the Pacific, we already have upped our game. But, you know, it's a journey, not a destination. You know, we don't win, China doesn't lose. China will always be an important economic partner for all those countries, and we shouldn't expect and we shouldn't want otherwise, frankly. So I don't think the election galvanises that in that respect. There's things have been happening for 10 years that have got us to the point where we are now. And so we're never, you know, going to declare victory or anything like that, you know. And I think we just, you know, Chinese are good at what they call struggle, you know, sort of a daily struggle to advance the system, advance their interests and the like. And I think we need a greater intensity in this country, a little bit of our own sort of CCP-style struggle, not struggle sessions where people are denounced, but a bit more intensity. But I don't think the election's the trigger for that. I think it's happening already.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we do like to finish on time. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you've enjoyed today's discussion and want to hear more, you can watch our first Year Ahead event that was held in Melbourne, and that is on the Lowy Institute website. At that event, we heard from the Australian Financial Review's Jennifer Hewitt, the National Affairs columnist, as well as Lowy Institute experts Dan Flitton, Lydia Carlo and Sam Roggeveen. Otherwise, we look forward to welcoming you back to Bligh Street for more events throughout 2025. But please join me in thanking our excellent panellists tonight. Thank you and good afternoon.